All right. Hello, everybody. Hello to the viewers. Hello to OG Rose, Daniel Garner, and hello to John David. We are here for our third session on Hayden White's book, The Tropics of Discourse. And the essay or the chapter we are discussing this time is called Interpretation in History. So in this chapter, White is talking about what interpretation is, how should we distinguish interpretation from other non-interpretive activities, and different types of interpretation, and how historians employ interpretation while they're explaining, if they do that. So we can discuss interpretation in opposition to other concepts, also, as well as discussing it as part of other activities. So interpretation could be opposed to explanation, or it could be something that sneaks in while we are trying to provide an explanation. So I thought maybe we can begin talking about that distinction between interpretation, what it is, and how it is that we might miss it in the works of not just historians, but even with our own personal history. It's something that I find it highly applicable, not only to history, but everything that has a historical dimension, personal, autobiography, biography, psychology even. So let's begin with that interpretation and its relationship with explanation. John?
Okay, I think what Hayden White is doing, just to sort of open up the conversation, is he's kind of constructing a deep grammar of historiography. And what he's doing is drawing a distinction between what I would call a crude sort of, what's the word that Marx uses for bad communists? The word is escaping me, but there's a simplistic notion of history and historiography about it. It's being the collection of facts, dates, very empirical, positivistic names, places, and that organizing that data in a certain sort of way, that's what history is. But he really wants to sort of upend that simplistic picture of historiography. And he says that in history and historiography, what we inevitably end up doing is, and this goes back to the first essay, the introductory, not the first essay, the introduction to the book, which is where he introduces the idea of tropics in the first place, is this how you couch your presentation of historical events is just as much a fact, an artifact of the historiographical moment as the actual facts that you're relaying. He calls this emplotment. So it's basically how you tell a story. He's absolutely fascinated with fourfold typologies. So he has four kinds of emplotment. He calls them romance, comedy, tragedy, and satire. We can go into what those are later. But, and he distinguishes between two more kinds of interpretation too, and we can go into those later. But I think emplotment is the big argument that he's trying to make in the first half of the essay. And he has four kinds of them. And that emplotment is basically sort of an aesthetic choice. It's irreducibly personal. I kind of have a problem with the title of the essay, because interpretation to me is not something that the writer of history does. It's something that the reader has done after the fact. So, when I'm writing history, I don't interpret it, at least not consciously. It's the reader who reads my book who does the interpretation. I would say that what he's really talking about is sort of the aesthetic turn in historiography. It's the art. When people say that writing history is both an art and a science, of course he wants to deconstruct that sort of simplistic dyad, but he's really focused here on the art of emplotment, of telling the story, how you tell it. Daniel?
Well, thank you, John. Well, again, I think I mentioned this last time. It's funny, the more I read this book, the more I go, man, how many books are out there that I've gone through my life not knowing exist, that when I read this, I'm like, how did I go through life not knowing this exists? There's always kind of a magic when you discover a neat book like that. It's funny you mentioned the title, because I was thinking, it's so interesting. What does it mean to interpret if we just use that language? Because I think you're making an interesting distinction between almost interpretation and arrangement. And it's almost like he's talking about interpretation of how do you decide that this is valuable for the plot you want to tell, and therefore you're including it, sort of that judgment. Almost it could be a judgment in history. It'd be interesting to sort of talk about that. But to use his language, it's almost like, how do you interpret something that you're still in the middle of? How do you interpret history while you're still in history? It's almost like a feeling that you start interpreting a novel not from the end, but from the middle, when really arguably the only way to interpret a novel well is from the end. But we're in this situation where we have to start in the middle. And therefore we break up history into historic episodes. And then we decide that episode per se is over and can begin our interpretation. But of course, who decides when an episode is over? Who can decide what constitutes the beginning of this episode and the end of the episode, so that you have a whole from which a quote unquote interpretation is valid? And right there is a kind of formal consideration. I also really liked this interesting point where he says historians can't escape interpretation because the historical record is both too full and too sparse. I liked where he was saying that at the beginning. And I was thinking about that. And I love what you said at the beginning, Davood, because it's like, if you ask me, how's your day, Daniel? What did you do today? You actually find yourself in a very similar dilemma. Do you really want to hear how I got the third knife at the end of the kitchen to use the waffle to do the butter, and then how I took 4 steps? No, you don't want to hear all that. I instantly and actually subconsciously know that I'm not supposed to give you a quote unquote full account of how my day has gone. I'm supposed to pick certain elements and leave out other elements in order to give you a proper account. And what's interesting is that it's almost like the historian has a similar dilemma there, right? That they have to determine, do you really want to know what General Grant was eating April 3rd in the morning, before he went out to the court? Is that really something you want to know? It's a fact, but it might not be a significant fact. So right there's this act of the historian having to make judgments about which details should be included that would make the account something engaging and that you would care about. Because if you literally had all the facts of the historical account, 1, you might be overwhelmed, and then 2, it may not feel significant to you. So there's something, and that gets into the question too, to get to what you were saying, Davood, if I am telling you what I did today, is that an interpretation or an explanation? Am I explaining to you how I got to you to answer the question of what I did today? In a way I am, because I'm telling you what I did that therefore led to this point, but it's also in that very act of explanation, some sort of judgment. Because I think that's really interesting what you're saying, John. There is something inappropriate about the word interpretation. And now I want to say judgment almost, but we might have trouble overlaying the language. But there's something, I guess there's an interpretation and judgment, but some kind of judging of value there, interpreting this as valuable, therefore judging. But anyway, there's something about in telling you what I did today, I am judging which facts are adequate and which are not, which are giving you an explanation, but that is married with that choice of judgment to bring it forth. I think it is interesting too, what he's saying, that there seems to be an emphasis for the historian to claim that they're doing more explanation than interpretation, because explanation feels more objective, more scientific, where interpretation feels kind of fuzzy to them. But he wants to, it seems to me, Mr. White wants to tear that down. And there almost also seems to be a fear that if you have an explanation and there's any interpretation at all, it almost corrupts the explanation. It's almost like a milk and dye thing. So you want to deny the role of interpretation and kind of present it as pure explanation, even if that is not totally possible, because there must be some sort of implotment, as John is saying, that would have to have some element of judgment or interpretation involved.
Excellent. Yeah. So I'll go back to that opposition between explanation and interpretation, or maybe a third component we have. The first is the component of conveying information, a collection of facts, and they might be disorganized, as you said, Daniel. They might be like a sense of pointlessness in why are you including this piece of information in a collection of historical facts. Explanation comes in partly as a result of history's aim at being a science, being more than just subjective reports, unhelpful reports that don't connect to the listener or don't add any explanatory value. And we can talk about explanation also in terms of the effect it produces in the audience. So it's not just explanation as something, a piece of a piece that is being communicated to somebody else, but explanation as a kind of effect produced in the mind of the person who is reading it or listening to it. And it has a special kind of satisfying effect. So when something is explained to me, I feel like, oh, okay, I get it. I get it in the sense that it is now explained to me. I don't just know that the First World War began. I know kind of why it must have begun. So explanation is, in its most scientific sense, it is when you subsume an event under a so-called covering law. This is the Carl Hempel approach, that everything has to strive to be as scientific as, all disciplines should strive to be as scientific as they can, as possible. So you talk about a historical event, a historical fact, ultimately by talking about why it should be what it is, or it must have been what it was, and by bringing in a law that event is expression of that law. But White here also includes the discussion of other forms of explanation. That's, I think, is extremely important. This hard science model of explanation shouldn't be the only way we think about scientific activity and ways of explaining. So maybe I can bring into the discussion those three other modes. Really, one other mode that stands in opposition to the covering law attitude, and that is, we don't focus on the law, the general law, to explain away this piece of historical fact or an event, but instead we focus on the particularity of the historical moment or historical fact. We just try to clarify it, bring it into view, connect it to surrounding context as much as possible, connect the part, which is an individual event, to the whole, so part-whole relationship, historical atmosphere, and without having to necessarily bring in that deterministic attitude of this is a historical law, it had to happen. So these are modes of explanation, and they are connected to what John mentioned, which are the modes of implantment. So the way in which we want to provide historical explanation has something to do indirectly to the kind of story the kind of organization that we bring into the collection of facts. Yeah, that wasn't very organized. John?
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking about where I want to go next, what I want to talk about. But yeah, he talks about, he's always sort of comparing, and I think the word I was looking for earlier was a vulgar Marxists. You've heard that term. I was trying to describe a very common idea of what history and historiography is a vulgar idea of it as being a collection of facts, dates, places, etc. But he also makes this distinction between historians like Jacob Burckhardt, Jules Michelet, with historiographers, I guess you could call them, like Marx, Hegel, Nietzsche. And in, I guess, the popular historical imagination, there's a vast difference between historians who are recording, say, a history of the French Revolution, or, in Burckhardt's case, a history of the European Renaissance, with what, say, Marx or Hegel are trying to do. He calls, he more associates, or it, like I said, in that popular vulgar imagination, he more associates the former with that sort of just a chronological recollection of events, and the latter, people like Marx, Hegel, and Nietzsche, with he uses this word a couple of times in the essay, an overdetermined conception of what they want to do is sort of put history under an umbrella and sort of present an overarching law or set of laws which govern history. So, for example, you can look at Marx, and he's all about the historical self-knowledge of the proletariat and historical materialism, right? Hegel is all about the synthesis, the antithesis, or the thesis antithesis coming together and creating a synthesis. So two opposites sort of coming together and increasingly creating the real. That's what Marx, what Hegel's idea of history is all about. History is a process of becoming. And obviously Marx drew heavily from Hegel, but those are just two conceptions of what I think people think of the more complicated philosophical type of history going on, more historiography than history. But I enjoyed in the essay how he sort of wanted to problematize the distinction between the two, because we think of one as facts, dates, figures, and the other one as theory and interpretation and fluffy and woolly and humanities. But his whole argument is that everything incorporates both. Both kinds of writing and thinking use both the raw facts of history, but also couched, imploded in the actual telling, the act of telling.
No, that's lovely, John. And I think it also seems to me, so I like to use the term monotheory, like a single, you have monotheorism and monotheory, like a single theory to explain everything. And often you do have in certain thinkers, like a single theory by which we can understand all phenomenon, when really what we need to be is more so polytheorists, people who have multiple theories by which we understand that are in conversation with one another. And it's almost as if what Mr. White would like us to understand is that if historical accounts entail different emplotments, well, then the name of the game is to get the emplotments working like in conversation with one another, to have kind of almost a dialectical relationship with one another. Because if we deny that there's emplotment going on, well, then we're just looking for the truest history, right? The truest facts, and we're not going to be aware of the role of emplotment in the formulation of understanding of history. And so then we're certainly not going to have any sort of dialectic, if you will, between the different emplotment possibilities. And so therefore we're going to have a trouble. So I see Mr. White, if I'm using the language from my essay, the essay I'm talking about is trying to be a polytheorist in regard to history, or to trying to make us aware of how emplotment is always there, and therefore how can we get them in discussion with one another? Because if we don't do that, well, one, we're fooling ourselves because that's always at play. Two, we're not going to have a more robust understanding of history that brings those things into conversation. And three, we're also not going to realize I think toward the end of the essay, there was some talk about how that different forms, different types of emplotment have certainly ideological alignments. Now, whether we agree with those ideological alignments or not, or if that's just Mr. White's interpretation of the ideological alignments is a different question. But the idea that there are ideological alignments, he wants us aware of that, because then we might unconsciously ascribe to a certain history that makes us in service of a certain ideology that we are not aware that we are in service of, that could empower that ideology erroneously, that perhaps we could avoid ideological capture as such if you did have a dialectical relationship between different empowerments. And the other thing I was just going to say is I think there's something about us wanting history to be explanation, Davood, to what you were saying, because there's something about history that feels like origin. And if we understand our origin, we know where we come from, and therefore we know what we are. And we're also looking for an explanation for what we are that we can get a hold on and that we can understand, so that we can feel like we can get our bearings. And it may also be the case that we like thinking about history in terms of explanation, because it feels like more of an explanation for ourselves, and therefore can give us more of a sense of stability in who we are. But of course, this might be a little bit of wish fulfillment, because it makes us, it incentivizes us to ignore the role of the interpretation or judgment, if to use those language, that might be at play in history.
If you don't mind me breaking the order,
Please.
just
Sure.
to make one quick, say what?
Of course.
Of course.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to point out something that starts at the bottom of page 60, where he's talking about Levi Strauss.
Yes.
And so this is if you're reading from the same text, I'm 5 lines from the bottom. If, as Levi Strauss correctly observes, one can tell a host of different stories about the single set of events conventionally designated as the quote-unquote French Revolution, this does not mean that the types of stories that can be told about the set are infinite in number.
Dude, I love this part. I got like a star and stuff. I love
The
this
types of stories that can be told about the French Revolution are limited to the number of modes of employment, which the myths of the Western literary tradition sanction as appropriate, of endowing human processes with meaning. So he's kind of saying that, and I think he would be very pro, dialectical, that yes, comedy should talk to tragedy, should talk to irony, but that ultimately our ways of understanding some historical duration or event is limited by the Western, or let's not just say Western, but literary traditions, genres of literary traditions.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And this, like, if you really want to zoom out and take like the eagle's eye view of this, he's talking about historiography as a kind of genre.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh no, and to add to that, John, no, that's key, because he also seems, I get in the sense he wants to give us a sense of how there's interpretation, but it's bound interpretation. There's dialectic, but it's bound. It's not just going off into a, because we always tend to think of, I guess our natural inclination is to think of interpretation as mere interpretation, or also kind of an endless expansion of interpretation on interpretation that kind of dilutes into nothing. And what he wants to do is find, and I think that's where using the novel as metaphor, as we've discussed, is so critical, because can you do anything in a novel as a writer? It seems like it, but not actually, because that's deus ex machina. There are certain rules you have to follow in a good novel in order to make it work. Likewise, in a construction of history, even if there's an interpretation, there are in fact still things that bind it to make it good. It just seems like anything can go. And I think that's also, as a side note, a misunderstanding of Derrida, but that's another topic for another time. So I think that's a great, I wrote a big giant star next to that section, John. That was perfect. I love that.
When you read a novel or when you go see a play, for example, there are a set number of words that you're going to use to describe your experience. It was a fantasy, it was science fiction, it was a comedy, it was drama, it was tragedy. And I mean, you can go on, but you can't go on infinitely. I mean, there might be 20, 30, 50 words, maybe, depending on how much you want to break down each one. Right. But I mean, it's kind of well limited, delimited.
It blows my mind. Like, you hear Western people talk, it's like, well, there's 5 interpretations, so there's infinite. Like, that doesn't follow at all, but that's how people talk. It's like there's more than one, therefore it's infinite. It's like, no, it's like 15. 15 is not even close to 100, but we have this tendency to jump from saying, oh, there's 15 possibilities, therefore anything goes. It does not make sense.
Right.
So maybe now we can, in response to that, we can talk about possible pessimism that might arise, because we not only say, so there are two things to be careful about. First is that there is interpretation that the mind of the historian adds to the material, to the vulgar material of history. That's the first step. The second step is that interpretive addition has its own limitation. So even there's limited range of movement for the historian in their emplotment. So not only is there interpretation, but that interpretation itself is limited by these literary genres.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's worth saying that, even though he limits the number of emplotments to 4, he's obsessed with, like I said, 4-fold classifications. Right. If anyone's interested, go on and read Metahistory, which is like a 400-page expansion of this essay, and you'll see what I mean about the 4-fold classification. But anyway, oh God, what was I going to say? Davood, what were you saying?
We were talking about the limited interpretation being limited by genres.
Got it. Okay. So even though he only has 4, you could very easily, if you wanted to, spend your entire 60-year career studying the French Revolution, only using those 4 types of emplotment, and not even exhaust the number of books that are out there, or the number of books that could possibly be written in those 4 types. So it's not to say that it provides a limit means there's only this much to learn. Right. It's that it's not infinite. Right. That our types of historical understanding are walled in by the fact that it's actually historical understanding, and that comes with impositions, with literary assumptions that you just can't go freeform with, that you have to work within. But
well, and that, just to note, I think a common mistake is calling something infinite if you could fill it for your lifetime. You know, we say, well, it's infinite if you could read a book for your entire life and never get to the end of it, therefore it's infinite. Well, that's 80 years. The difference between 80 and infinite is, oh, I don't know, trillions, you know, a very big number. But we have a tendency of calling things infinite. And that seems like, it doesn't seem like that matters, but it's actually huge, because calling something infinite is a dismissal term. It's when we say, oh, it's infinite, anything goes, well, we dismiss it. So to make a point that actually it's not infinite, it could fill a lifetime, but it's not technically infinite. It's maybe practically infinite, because you can't do it all, but it's not technically infinite. That's key, because then you can't dismiss things by saying, because I hear it all the time. People say, oh, well, to the reading of books, there's no end, like the end of Ecclesiastes. You could always read another history book on World War II. You could always read, so it never ends, so why do it? It becomes a dismissal. So I think it's really important, where White works so hard to try to bind the variables, to talk about bound interpretation, to use my language. So there's 4 types, because then you can't dismiss it. It's within the realm of saying, no, you can do it. You can do it for your entire life, and you may not want to spend every waking moment do it, but you can't just dismiss it. And I think we hear that all the time. People do that all the time. There's infinite information, there's infinite books, so why even try? It's terrible.
And people are sloppy with language, because what they really mean is infinite for the purposes of my life.
Yes,
I won't be able to understand it, so therefore
it is outside the finitude of me. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, it's another way to dismiss, another way in which, or reason why we might dismiss something, which is also wrong, is when we identify the absence of a privileged position, a privileged perspective for any discipline. Like, there is no privileged historian perspective that is detached, dissociated, and completely independent of other activities, genres,
right.
Other literary tendencies we have, the inherent structure of the human mind. Just because there is no privileged position and perspective, like what Hayek, I recently read about Friedrich Hayek, called this the supermind. The scientists want to claim that there is a supermind that is detached from other the other capacities and activities that people do. And just because we don't have that privileged position, let's just not do history at all. We should also not fall into that. We should just, the effect to me is that whatever we call history is itself not separate from the material that history is trying to explain. It is part of the same material of life, the human condition. Part of that material is history, and our tendency to add historical accounts to it. It doesn't hover above it. And that's on the one hand. On the other hand is meta-historical awareness that we have limits. We bring in our interpretation and explanation to our historical account. So for me, Hayden White is trying to connect history both to meta-history and show that history is not separate from meta-history, or shouldn't be separate from meta-history. And on the other hand, it shouldn't be separated from the material of history that it's trying to be about. Now, should we touch on a little bit on, go ahead, Daniel.
Oh, well, I didn't mean it, but I just wanted, it seems also to that point that White is playing this, it seems like people think that if history isn't objective, therefore it's dead, right? It's like that, it's no good. But what he wants to argue, it seems that if we understand history as a genre, then there can still be truth and value in it, because the key move is that he understands that a novel is not absent of truth. Like, a lot of people say, like, fiction is therefore false, it's fantasy. Anyone who knows great literature knows that's not the case. Even if fiction didn't happen, it can be full to the brim with truth. And so there's also this notion that if we think of history as having sort of genre novel construction to it, that's only a problem if we assume that a novel has no truth to it. And so, but if you don't do that, then this construct can save it from, one, living in a world where it denies there's any interpretation involved at all, which we know is not true. And if you deny that history has interpretation involved at all, well, then eventually people find out, and then they dismiss it as kind of a giant conspiracy of power or something like that. But then on the flip side, if you say that history is nothing more than fantasy, it's mere interpretation, well, then why bother to read it? What are you learning if you're just learning someone's take on things if it's merely that. So you have to find a middle road. And I think what's brilliant is that he has deduced that, well, and he's also that the thinking of it as a novel construct, a novel historian, as we put it, is a way to save it from both of those potential pitfalls.
Let me add one thing. There's Hayden White, as you might probably anticipate, gets a lot of crap from people in the field of history who want to save it and sort of retain this 19th century idea of it having the status of history, or sorry, science, of it having the status of science. And so he very often got criticized for essentially saying that history is nothing. It's diaphanous. It has no substance. You get nothing from it. It's just basically just complete fictional constructions from the imagination. Right. And I'm reading, these essays really carefully, and I hope thoughtfully. And one of his biggest critics actually is Richard Evans, who you might know for his gigantic trilogy about World War II. And he also wrote a book called In Defense of History, I think, in which he very briefly criticizes Hayden White. But I'm having trouble understanding how you can read these essays carefully and come across with this criticism of him that he's all about interpretation. He's saying that interpretation is an aspect. Right. And I guess that's too much for some historians to want to admit. I mean, all he wants to do is sort of, take an inch, and people are like, you're trying to take a mile, and he's not. They think of him as some sort of postmodernist. There is no truth. There is no history. It's all just, what's the word?
Different defenses of ideology, because that's something else. Yeah, he highlights it.
Yes, and I want to make a point of ideology when we get there too. But yes, the fact that it's all fluff, it's just foam, right? But he's not. I don't understand how people can make that legitimate criticism of him when you actually sit down and read these essays clearly, because all he's saying is that there is an aesthetic sort of mode in the way that you tell history. You use the facts, you use the raw data, and he's not arguing against that. He's just saying that there are ways that you can choose to tell a story.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's crazy is one, I think there's such a knee-jerk reaction against the word interpretation. Like, one, two, there's a knee-jerk reaction. I think it's also the association, like when you're saying, like, do you get nothing out of a novel? Like those criticisms would only work against what he's saying if you literally believe you don't get anything out of novels, right? Let's say he is saying that it's like kind of like a novel. Do you get nothing out of the Brothers Karamazov? Do you get nothing but pleasure out of the great works of literature of Homer? No, there's a lot more going on. So that association doesn't make sense. Two, it seems to me that a lot of where he's saying the role of interpretation is in the formal consideration of what the facts are put within, more so than of the facts themselves, which is a very critical distinction. Because if I'm saying, well, I'm actually interpreting that, I used the Civil War earlier, that actually Appomattox was not where the Civil War ended. I'm thinking that the Civil War really ended somewhere in Richmond or something. I don't know. That's not what he's doing. It's not chaos. There's a formal consideration where you say, well, this certain form, maybe as a tragedy, is the best way to convey the facts. That's not this kind of chaotic where you're treating the facts as a mirage, as an illusion, as stuff that's not there. You're saying you have to make a decision by how you implant the facts. And if you deny that, you're crazy. I mean, that's what I don't get. Like, how do you deny that? Like, how do you read that and say, nah, man, the implantment has there's no judgment the historian has to make to do that. That's not, and again, I make the point, if you deny, I think White understands it. If you deny that there's any role of the historian that blends the role of the Hegel, the historiography. If you deny that there's a merging of those in that position, it won't be long before people one day figure out that there is some role, and then you run the risk of them just blowing off the whole field because you didn't admit this element. You pretended like it was a whole science, and now that we know it's not entirely exactly like science, we're not going to take it seriously at all. And so, by actually White giving that inch per se, it's actually making the field more long-lasting, more anti-fragile, to use that Nassim Taleb language. And I don't think I appreciate, John, that you've read metahistory and that you know Mr. White so much better, because it strikes me listening to you that the critics do not appreciate how, in a sense, he's making history more anti-fragile.
Just one quick observation to hear some people criticize him. It's almost like you would think Hayden White is saying the sentence "Lee surrendered at Appomattox" has the same amount of truth value as "Lee surrendered at Abu Dhabi."
Or yeah, and that's what I'm trying to. Yes,
Moscow. You know, it's like there are some things which are just irreducibly true, and he's not going to deny. So,
yeah, that was a great way to put it. Thank you, John. That was a great way to put it.
I want to mention this: what is enabled by this relatively relativistic view of history or interpretive view of history. We don't have to say like, oh, we have options, so let's, instead of a tragic account of French Revolution, let me bring a satirical account of French Revolution. I think we don't have to just be limited to that kind of justification in historical accounts. Instead, we can say, this is what we get if we, rather than the common account of French Revolution, if we view it through the lens of, by means of emplotment of a satirical structure, this is what we get. This will be revealed to us if we employ this genre as our model, as our metaphor. So it's the balance of an inclusion of different methods of history, different kinds of emplotments is important because of the effects that the revelations that we will get as a result. And then we don't have to, if we look at it that way, if we look at different methods in terms of their consequence, then we don't have to say, okay, we have to choose now, because then we get a variety of consequences, variety of readings. Just like how a novel can say, if somebody comes and says, I want to do a psychoanalytic reading of Brothers Karamazov, I won't say, okay, so you want to reduce Brothers Karamazov to psychoanalysis? No, I understand. Tacitly, we understand that that person doesn't want to replace the novel with something else, just wants to add. If we view it through this lens, that's the kind of consequence we will get that we didn't get before, or maybe we underemphasized before.
But something that I think contributes to this problem is people want to think they can read a book and then they're done. When you start talking about different lenses, and that means I have to reread it. Oh my gosh, reread, or read multiple books about World War II. Oh no. You see, so there's something also about us wanting to believe that you don't have to have this dialectical relationship between all these different formulations of a historical event, because that means I have to read a lot. And I want to be able to go to cocktail parties and talk about the Civil War and come off as educated. And I really just want to be able to do that by reading one book. So, you know, what you're suggesting is that to really know something, you have to read a concert of books about a subject. And that just raises the bar to a point that people, they don't want to believe it. So I also think there's a bit of a bias to want to believe an understanding of history that makes it to where if I just pick the right book about World War II, which will just happen to be in line with your ideology, cough, cough. But if I just happen to pick the right one, that's the only one I need, because that absolves me the responsibility of engaging with a conversation, which also is going to probably confuse me, because I'll have different voices and then I'll have to wrestle with that confusion to figure out who's telling, you know, what to think of all the different voices. And that's way too existential. I just want to impress people at a cocktail party, Davood. You know, I don't want to do all that. So I think there's also that element at play.
Sure. Shall we now turn to ideology a little bit? So the assumption here is, go ahead.
We've thrown about this word of emplotment, and that there are 4 types of them. I'm not even sure. Maybe we should just briefly say something about what they are and what they mean. He doesn't really talk about, aside from naming them, he doesn't really assign and saying, you know, things like Jules Michelet was more of a romance historian, and Burckhardt was more of, did he call Burckhardt a satirist?
I think he did.
But just like what is a satirist?
Right.
In this sense, like what is a comic historiographer? So I found this thing. I'll be glad to share the link after the talk. It's a UK website. So when he says romance, he describes history writing and historians that celebrate the triumph of the good after trials and tribulations.
Huh.
So I guess the triumph of good over evil. That's a Roman. And by the way, notice the markedly genre-esque words that he uses: romance, comedy, tragedy, satire. Those are all directly taken from literature, which is where he wants you to go back and think about history tying back to genres from literature. So romance is about the good triumphing over the evil. Comedy is socially integrative and celebrates the conservation of shared human values against threats of disruption. Tragedy stresses the irreconcilable element of human affairs and laments the loss of the good necessarily entailed when values collide. He says Tocqueville is a classic example of tragedy. And satire sees only meaningless change in human life. Human affairs display no pattern and for the most part are governed by folly and chance. So those are four of the sort of classic ways that you can look at a series of events and want to say something about them.
Thanks for sharing that, John, because the point I was going to make is I was wondering, I found that lacking kind of detail. That makes a lot more sense.
You would think he goes into it in meta history, but you would think he would at least give a paragraph to it, but he doesn't.
Right, because I see the word tragedy and I go to The Fragility of Goodness by Martha Nussbaum, and I'm like, is that what he means? Maybe he doesn't mean, what is it? So I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, that was very helpful. That was very helpful.
You want to talk about ideology, Davood?
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So that actually helps us as a segue into ideology, because these the modes of implantment that you just talked about, they tend to be associated with. So somebody who they tend to be associated with particular kinds of ideological commitment or political commitment. We don't have to use necessarily the term ideology. So romance as a mode of implantment, as a choice in viewing a story or historical series of events, tends to go hand in hand with an anarchist, according to Hayden White, anarchist ideological commitment. And tragedy tends to be associated with a radical ideological commitment. So this is it brings a few things into my mind. One is like another reason why historians might be resistant to White is because he wants to. He insists that they should all reveal their ideological commitment, that whether they want it or not, with their decisions, they are already telling story in a way that is more in line, that is more compatible with a form of ideological commitment. So that's another reason why people might resist him. Another thought in my mind is that in discussions like this discussions that we're having now, we usually don't begin the discussion by announcing our political and ideological commitments. So is this something that is lacking from even like discussions like this? Is ideology something that we should keep in mind and guard against, at least as something that might be, might be operative? So those two, let's just keep those two on the table.
Should I get like a T-shirt that like says the ideology on the front during Zoom conversation? Maybe I'll get a T-shirt. That'll work.
Trump 2024.
Right there.
And one last thing, what I really loved about it, like towards the end of the essay, he said that the masterpieces of history, they are great because within them there is this tension between the form that they adopt and their other elements like ideological commitment. So if a historical work is completely consistent with its mode of implantment, with its mode of explanation, is this very total harmony between all the decisions that the historian has made, to him that is not it's not likely to be a masterpiece. A masterpiece preserves some kind of tension between the different decisions of the historian.
I wanted to say something about the ideology part that kind of leaves it more of an afterthought towards the end, but it would be interesting if you could spin it possibly into an essay later in the book. I can see how the third one that we haven't really talked about, again, because he makes even less of an idea talks about this, but is the mode of argument, or what he calls explanation, That's the third one that he talks about for maybe a split second.
For
But
a split
I can understand where implotment and the motive argument / explanation are conscious choices by the historiographer. I have more questions about the ideology. You come to history, the task of history and of writing it, being ideologically conditioned in certain ways. It is not your choice whether you want to write an anarchist or conservative or liberal or radical. Those are his fourfold breakdown of ideologies. That is a choice almost, this might be simplifying matters too much, but almost made for you by the decisions and commitments that you've made previously in your life. You can probably choose implotment, whether you want to make it a romance, comedy, tragedy, or satire, but can you choose whether you want to, make the French Revolution or the Renaissance or World War II or whatever else radical? Take someone like Christopher Hill, who was a Marxist historian. Can he write a conservative interpretation of the English Revolution? I don't know. I'm not sure he could write a convincing one. There are people who have done it, but could he do it? I don't know. Because I think, like I said, might be oversimplistic. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say, both of you. I think ideology might choose us instead of us choosing ideology.
No, that's delightful. One of the great writers that I like to talk about all the time, obviously I already mentioned the Brothers Karamazov, but is Dostoevsky. And one of the great geniuses of Dostoevsky, if we take the Brothers Karamazov as a great example, is who does he make the smartest character? It's Ivan, right? Well, he doesn't agree with Ivan at all. And his beliefs are completely counter to Ivan. Very often the characters in Dostoevsky who are the most elegant, who are the most intelligent, are very strong steelmans of who goes against Dostoevsky's own worldview. And in fact, often in the book, it's not necessarily clear which ideology prevails or which is best. It may be alluded to with Alyosha shouting yay at the grave at the end, but it's not necessarily clear if that's an act of denial or an act of looking forward to the resurrection to come. Dostoevsky in the act of writing is also in a battle with himself, it sometimes kind of feels like. Whereas when you get into a novel like Atlas Shrugged, for example, with Ayn Rand, it's quite clear, which characters are good, which characters are right versus which ones are bad, so forth and so on. So in some respects, the question to me is, can the historian be more like Dostoevsky than Ayn Rand? And what does that look like exactly? Can you have someone who is completely, it's almost like the question, should the person, if we keep using the Civil War as an example, should the person who thinks that the lost causers are completely insane do everything in their power to try to argue for the lost causer interpretation of the Civil War while they do their act of history? Will that act create a dialectical tension that will prove useful for the construction of the history? Whereas the person who's a full-fledged believer in the lost cause of the Civil War, the South being the victims and so on and so forth, should really go into their historical account trying to show that, no, it wasn't the war of northern aggression. This, in fact, was a justified action of the US government. Is that what he means when he's talking about the dialectical tension? That's something that came to mind, because I do say in my own work, when I do a short story, it's really, really important. Like if I have a character that's talking about ideas, that I myself don't believe any of those ideas, that I myself actually intentionally have the smart characters be ones that don't think like me, because it's almost too difficult. If the smart characters do think like I think personally, it's almost too difficult to not make them preachy, to not make the story flat, to not make the novel fall apart. And there certainly isn't going to be any interesting drama. It's just how the characters end up interacting that destroys the text. So I myself have to be very aware that when I do fiction, that my ideas are the ones that are not agreed with by the characters, that it's always in the background, because that just is a way to balance myself. And that's kind of what I got thinking about as I was reading those sections with White.
There's no easier way to make a character flat, yes, boring, one-dimensional, and lame, literally, yes, lame-footed almost, yes, absolutely, and to make them preachy.
Yes, absolutely.
And of course, that's not to say that no one in the Brothers Karamazov actually has ideas that they defend, but they defend them in such a sophisticated way because Dostoevsky is invested in being able to argue with himself because he is a superior novelist, whereas Ayn Rand, in my humble opinion, is a fourth-rate hack.
Sure. And it's because in Ayn Rand, you don't even have, the only tension is between the forces, but you don't have it in the person themselves. And that changes everything. One, it's not realistic because primarily our main battle is with ourselves in our own tension. And the great plot of the quote unquote looters is not something we in our practical lives encounters. The other thing that Dostoevsky does that's so critical is who is the character that, we have that quote, if God didn't exist, everything would be permitted, right? And that's always attributed to Alyosha. Critically, it's actually Ivan around the beginning of the book who says something like, if there was no immortality, there would be no values. But of course, his whole critique against God is, letting the children suffer and all these forth and so on. But that means Ivan can only have that critique against God if God exists to give him the ethical compass to go against God. So right in Ivan and there's that image on the fence the whole time. So there's a great tension in Ivan the entire time that I like to talk about. And so can the historian do something like that? Should the historian choose to focus on people of history that are more like Ivan than John Galt, per se? And that seems to be what he's suggesting. And yet it must be done in a manner that does not dilute the historical count of its, in fact, history. You have to maintain that. But he really does seem to want the historian to take those novel-esque considerations into account.
And just, you say novel-esque, look how seamlessly we go from history to novels.
Yeah,
they naturally feed into one another.
Absolutely. And that's only a problem if there's no truth in novels. Like that's, the whole idea that Hayden White is a relativist and there's no truth. There's only a problem with that connection if you've fallen for the idea that art is nothing more than pleasure, that it's nothing more than entertainment. If you don't buy that premise, then what White is doing is great. It's that there's a mistaken assumption that people have about novels, frankly, being a waste of your time. That is what a lot of people think. Like, why would you read a novel? What do you get out of it? Why not just read a nonfiction New York Times? People are doing book clubs about these New York bestseller top 10 nonfiction books and whatever. And they'll, but they're not doing it on novels because they believe that it's the nonfiction you get truth from. And it's a terrible impoverishment.
Do you have something against Oprah's book club?
John, I'm sorry. I should not be so knee-jerk against Oprah. It's so terrible. I take it all back.
She is the greatest intellectual of our day.
I take it all back. I take it all back. Let me just put this here. I am sorry. You probably can't even read it. I'm sorry. I'm a fool. Sorry. I messed up. Anyway, no.
I want to go back to that idea of ideology chooses us. In other words, ideology is so entangled with the decisions that we have already made or decisions that we have had to make to get here. And another way of talking about it, I think, is to say that ideology, this was a really great point to make, because it works as, in part, a cultural criticism. In our day, we might see a lot of people who say, oh, I choose the color of my car, like it's red, and I also choose my political leanings. I'm a leftist. It really hides the fact that our ideological leanings or ideological commitment is something that is a necessity, or it can be brought into life as an act of desperation. And again, this is really clearly expressed in novels. It is shown how these kinds of commitments are life-preserving, preserving of a form of life, a set of decisions. And whether or not it can ever become a decision for us, I think it can, as long as we become aware of it as a product of other decisions. So in the process, it is developed, it takes form, and then it becomes something that can be in front of us for examination, as something that can be in dialectical relationship with other decisions or the other facts of life. But of course, it is first necessary to bring it into view and to point to it and say, ideology has chosen you, and so now what you're going to do. But if we are, unfortunately, I got on a tangent.
I love that point. No, it's a great point. It brings to mind the image of Jacob wrestling God. And so likewise, we don't choose our ideology, but we need to like fight it almost. It's almost like if you didn't have an ideology that chose you, you wouldn't have material to fight with. And it's precisely that fighting with, that wrestling with, that makes great work, that makes great history. So by all means, the like you were saying, the Marxists can't help but have Marxist ideology, and they'll never be able to write the history exactly like the Haykian conservative. But both of them can go, I'm a Marxist, I'm a Haykian conservative, I need to fight with that. I need to wrestle with that, or my work will not be compelling. It won't have any dialectical drive. And so, you know, it's that wrestling with God, wrestling with ideology that I think can help create, can help make great works.
I love that. Wrestling with the inner God.
yeah, absolutely.
There's this distinction in physiological psychology between perception and proprioception, right? The fact that you have, or perception, and it's they say in philosophy, perception versus apperception. So it's the fact that you are perceiving or feeling or sensing versus the feeling that you know that you are feeling or perceiving or sensing. So not just being a passive receptive vehicle for your sensations, but being conscious of the fact that you're receiving them. And you can sort of use that same approach with ideology. You can say that, you know, well, I have these proclivities, I have this ideology, but I can also do my very best to try to talk to and understand other people from other political traditions. Knowing how I've been conditioned to try to come to terms with, reconcile the truths that they may have to offer, having come from theirs.
No, and to bring it to what we were saying at the start, it's almost like what White wants us to do is to make us aware that we are interpreting, because if we're not aware we're interpreting, we won't wrestle with it. It's like you have to be aware of the emotion, or you're not even going to do it. So it's like, if you guys keep saying that history is a science, you ain't going to do any of that wrestling that we're describing. And so you're not going to have this dialectical drive that's going to make great works. And so being aware that interpretation is playing a role is not the death of history, but the elevation of it into new forms of greatness. Because it's a wrestling. Of history. It's a renaissance is what he's doing. It's not a death, it's a renaissance.
But the awareness is key.
The awareness is key, absolutely.
That's a great point to maybe end on. So we realize that we are interpreting, and then we realize what it takes to be able to interpret the other commitments, surrounding commitments. Right. Yes. And the elevation and renaissance.
What a beautiful way to end.
Beautiful. Yeah. You guys are great. I love talking to you. I mean, I'll go to IHOP, you go to Waffle. We got to keep doing this, man. We'll go to IHOP or Waffle House. This is wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, gentlemen.